Before I start my time, I just want to say a quick thank you to all of the members of the audience. A big thank you to Dwayne for being here and being my partner today, and of course, a massive thank you to our guests from Rwanda for being here with us today. Now, without further ado, let's talk about the UN. Starting now, Zach. Okay, so to begin my speech, I'd like to give a little bit of context. So first, when we are talking about the United Nations was started following World War II in 1945. The main goal of this organization exists to prevent further conflicts similar to that war, right? Now, it has many stated objectives. Two of them are relevant to today's debate. First is the objective of maintaining international peace, and second is the objective of promoting human rights. Now, within its peacekeeping mission, the UN defines it as a way to help countries torn by conflict create conditions for sustainable peace. To that effect, they have completed 57 missions since 1948 and are currently participating in 15 current missions. And we are saying that these missions have largely been a failure. To that end, we will be presenting you with three main arguments. So first, we will be talking about how the limited rules of engagement that the UN enforces on its missions are actually preventing it from making any effective change. Second, we will be talking about how the political structure of the UN and the inherent politics present within it are actually preventing it also from making any effective change and implementing peace. And third, we will talk about how specifically UN peacekeepers violate laws promoting global rape culture and overall have very bad record on sexual assault by its peacekeepers. So with that, let's get, and by the way, much of this analysis actually is going to come from the Brahimi reports, which were published by UN. And in that report, the conclusion basically, to read it directly, is that the UN should refrain from undertaking further peace enforcement actions within the internal conflict of states. In other words, basically they themselves are admitting that it's a failure, right? But let's get to our arguments, right? Starting with first the limited rules of engagement. So when UN goes into a state to commit peacekeeping actions, right, it has very specific, very limited rules of engagement usually, right? But the thing is, those rules are usually, and they're specific to each mission, so it's very hard to say anything broad about them. But generally speaking, these rules forbid the UN from engaging with any hostile actors. They forbid the UN from exercising any sort of discretion in like developing situations, and they usually are not allowed to intervene even in cases of like clear evil, such as cases of like genocide, right? I'll take you on top of this point. So yeah, and so in short, UN is actually extremely limited to simply being present. And what we and my partner are going to bring to you is the idea that we think that mere presence is simply not enough in most conflict areas, right? We believe that active action is required, and without that active action, you're really not going to achieve any change, right? And we have an example of this actually of Rwanda, which is actually a perfect example of exactly this kind of issue, right? Because the fact is that the main general that was deployed by UN in Rwanda before the genocide actually had credible information about the upcoming genocide. He contacted the UN headquarters, who basically told him that it was outside the rules of engagement and therefore they really didn't do anything, right? And we think that at a point that you have an agency that is tasked with keeping the peace, right, that agency now knows that there's a coming genocide, which I think we'd all agree is the exact opposite of peace, that you're basically kind of creating, right, that you're in some way actually complicit to that act of genocide, and you're actually making the situation worse, right? But what's worse is that in Rwanda, once the genocide started, what happened? Once it started and a few UN peacekeepers got killed, they basically just reduced the number of peacekeepers by 90%. So they withdrew all of their people. They basically evacuated and left the country to their own devices. And then even refused to acknowledge the events as genocide. And we think this is uniquely harmful because at the end of the day, right, if you're there to uphold the peace and you're telling the world that, hey, we got this under control, we think that you have a responsibility to actually engage and do something rather than simply leave or simply not do anything. Again, mere presence is not enough. We need active action, right? Now, I'll take the POI if you still have it.
So does that mean that you're basically saying that none of the peacekeeping actions that you talked about involved intervention?
Okay, so here's the thing, right? the peacekeeping actions, usually when the UN does intervene, it also usually kind of results in failures. It usually results in people dying, which we think is not good, right? But then second of all, most of the time they actually don't intervene, which is not making the situation worse. My partner will talk more about the alternative that we are presenting through local action and that kind of advocacy. So second, let's talk about the UN, particularly how it's subject to politics, right? Because the idea is that the United Nations only gets involved if there's no resistance to it getting involved, right? The Security Council is ultimately the body that decides whether the UN gets involved or not. The problem with that is that one of the members of the one of the members of the Security Council that has veto power is involved, then the UN is basically guaranteed not to get involved. What do I mean by that, right? Well, take, for example, the Chechnya War. The Chechnya War is a regional conflict that exists between Russia and Chechnya, which is kind of an autonomous region, right? The problem there is that that war is plagued by human rights violation, right? It is plagued by war crimes, by torture, by looting, rapes, and beheadings, and yet the United Nations basically doesn't actually deploy there. Why does it not deploy there, right? Well, simple fact, Russia's on the Security Council. Anytime the UN wants to do something, Russia just vetoes it, right? And again, at a point that you're an agency that is tasked with keeping the peace, right, when you even refuse to keep the peace based on who the actors are, you're really not fulfilling that mission. Very quickly also on the third point, which is the sexual abuse argument, right? And this again comes from the Brahimi report, where the High Commissioner of UN, to quote directly, says that there exists a culture of impunity within the United Nations, which is continuing to be prevalent and difficult to overcome. We say that there's a unique structure in the UN that actually enables that rape culture to exist. What do we mean by that? Well, currently, the process is that if something happens, right, it's supposed to be reported to the superior officer of the soldier that's involved, right? And it gets passed up the chain and up the chain and up the chain. The problem with that is that at any point in that chain, it can get simply thrown out, and that's what happens the majority of the times. But even if, in the rare scenario where it doesn't get thrown out, it actually results in basically just it being referred to the military of the soldier, which, if we're talking about countries like Saudi Arabia and stuff, have very poor violations. We see this in Congo, and my partner will also elaborate on that. So for those reasons, we're very proud to support and uphold the motion. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, first we would like to thank all of you for being here, and we would like to thank the University of Miami for having us. And thank you to the proposition side for being here and debating with us. Now on to the debate. The motion for tonight is this House believes the UN has failed its peacekeeping responsibility. Tonight's debate is not whether the UN has brought peace or not into the world, because technically it's still in progress and it makes no sense to debate about this. The debate tonight is not whether or not the existence of the UN has led to a more peaceful world, but rather the debate for tonight is about whether or not the UN peacekeeping missions that have been undertaken in the 60 years have failed or succeeded in achieving their set goals. Tonight's debate is complicated because it requires us to examine a concept that we cannot fully define, and that's peace. As the NEG, we would like to say that peace is far more than the absence of conflict, but rather the presence of institutions that provide justice, economic well-being, and security for the people. The first observation that we will make is that the UN peacekeeping mission are dealing with complex conflict situations that are fragile, and that require its approach to be multidimensional. Despite the fact that these missions are complex, the number shows that not only has the US been able to achieve its goals, but it created a framework for durable peace that to be achieved. Now, as he said, the UN has started 72 peacekeeping missions. 57 were completed, and 15 remaining are in the process of completion. Now, you need to understand that of those 57, 55 of them have been successfully completed. And also you need to understand that peacekeeping missions are not just about ending war. They're not just about ending the conflict between people. They are comprised of different other missions, which the first is observational missions. Now, these missions require unarmed troops that are meant to observe and report what's happening. They do not necessarily have power to change anything that is going to happen in the country, just to observe. Another type of mission would be multidimensional peacekeeping operations. These are called upon not only to maintain peace and security, but to facilitate the political process, protect civilians, assist in the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of former combatants, support the organization of election, protect and promote human rights, and assist in restoring the rule of law. Now, the biggest achievement of the UN forces, can be shown by its community impact projects. First, they have created weapon-free zones. They have created literacy and education. For example, UN mission in Mali was to provide literacy and education to adults. Another thing, healthcare. They have provided 58% of children in the world with vaccination, and that is 30 million women with women maternal health efforts. Secondly, Rwanda's UN troops over the years has been building classrooms, hospitals, train locals to use energy-saving stoves, and lead communities into cleanups and environmental programs. The UN peacekeeping forces has also worked to solve conflicts that were caused by mismanagement of natural resources. For example, the UN mission in Democratic Republic of Congo, they regulated the efficient use of resources that the country possesses, since most conflicts in the country were at the basis of these resources. For example, rape, killings, and many more. Another example would be multidimensional integrated stabilization mission in Central African Republic. For example, they supported enhanced inclusive political dialogue to provide good officers, technical expertise in support of efforts to address roots and causes of conflict in that country. The UN peacekeeping missions have also worked to promote women peace and security by ensuring women priorities at all levels are taken into consideration when making a peace decision, address social, cultural, political barriers, and protect risks. I will give you time after. Protect risks that limits women's full participation in achieving and sustaining peace. Yes?
Yeah, so you keep expanding the definition of peacekeeping by the UN, right? But the UN specifically gives the definition that it is that the peacekeeping mission is a way to help countries torn by conflict to create conditions for sustainable peace. Can you engage with that, please?
And that's what I'm talking about. Peacekeeping missions in the UN is not just about to stop wars. It's about to go at the roots of that wars. And I gave examples. In the DRC, these conflicts were caused by the inefficient use of resources. And they have gone to that. The UN missions in the DRC was to ensure the efficient use of the natural resources that was in that country. And through all those peacekeeping missions, the 55 that were successful, this has been achieved. Food has been provided to 90 million people in over 75 countries. They assisted more than 34 million refugees in the world. They minimized climate change by working with 140 nations. They assisted about 50 countries per year with their elections. They provided vaccination for 58% of children in the world. That's about 4 billion child as a total. And they also helped about 30 million women per year with maternal health efforts. So if we are to evaluate the impact of the UN peacekeeping missions, we will have to have a broader definition on what constitutes peace building, and that the UN has done a tremendous job in doing so, despite the fact that they will never be noticed. Thank you.
Before I start my speech, I would like to thank you all for being here. It is an honor and a privilege to be able to speak in front of you all. I would like to thank a few organizations. First, I would like to thank American Senior High School, the Miami-Dade Urban Debate League, the University of Michigan Debate League, and all of the audience for allowing me for this opportunity to debate in front of you and to do what I love. Now I'll begin with a story. Early morning on Sunday, March 16th, 1975, 3 women and a child were in their bedrooms. They were awakened by the sounds of 2 men breaking down their door. Now, these 2 men raped and tortured one of these women. After that occurred, the 2 other women decided to call the police. Now, the police responded. They responded to the situation, but they never engaged in the situation. They patrolled the area. They stayed dormant and never truly went into the house or ever took action. The women started screaming. Now, their screaming alerted the individuals who broke into their house. And for 14 hours, they were robbed, raped, and beaten. This is the epitome of the UN when they are intervening, quote unquote, in these nations. They assume that their presence is security, but their presence is not enough. There must be more action. Now, this case is called Warren versus the District of Columbia. And the District of Columbia and the jury and the judge voted in the favor of the defendant, i.e. the District of Columbia. They said that they were following the public duty doctrine. Now, the public duty doctrine, when applying this to the UN, is the epitome of their rules of engagement, their limited rules of engagement. They claim that they are doing something, but they truly are not taking action. Now, I would like to rebut a few of my opponent's points. First, they expanded the definition of what it means, of what peacekeeping means. The definition, according to the UN, is that they help countries torn by conflict create long-lasting peace. Secondly, the UN decides which missions succeeded and failed. But they are not an agent that is effective when it comes to that. Now, this goes into our argument of co-option. Now, as I go into this argument, I'm speaking about the UN using local efforts and not truly taking action, and using those efforts that happen locally and claiming those victories as their own in order to forward the notion of their own good faith rhetoric to the world. Now, Giorgio Agamben, a philosopher, Italian philosopher, very modern day, he talks about this thing called the state of exception. Now, the state of exception is a theory that forced the notion that the world powers and the sovereign power constantly forward the notion of a fear or a violence in order to enact or allow the inaction of violence abroad, but still shift the public eye from that violence. Why did I make this point? I'm sorry. So they attempt to shift the public eye from the violence that they are committing. This can be founded in the epitome. The epitome of this is the Democratic Republic of Congo, in which the UN committed 15,000 rapes per year in 1999 during that intervention. However, they used what my opponent said as the reason, as a justification of that violence. Yes, what is your point?
You're saying they're not taking action. What do you think of the 4 billion lives that they saved?
The 4 billion lives that they saved at the cost of what? And what is the quality of that life once they finish intervening? Now, off that point, right after I make this point. Now, off that point, this leads me to talking about the epitome of what the UN's blue helmet represents. Now, to the world, on the world stage, this may represent something of peace and inclusivity. However, in these nations that they intervene, this represents a reminder of the hideous and heinous crimes that they have committed in these countries. For example, I'm going to give an example, actually. So imagine a murderer comes into your house and he kills your entire family in front of you, and he slits their throats with a knife while you sit there and watch. Now that knife hangs up in your common room area in your house every day as a reminder of the violence that was committed by that murderer. That is the epitome of the blue helmet in these nations, the UN's blue helmet in these nations. Yes, what is your PI? Okay. Now I'm going to move on to my third and final point, which is, to quote the great Audre Lorde, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Now, I allude this to my SVS link, meaning Savage Victim Savior. The countries that represent the Security Council who ultimately decide these peacekeeping missions, i.e. Russia, the United States, China, the United Kingdom, and France, all have committed heinous crimes and essentially commodified both the land and the people of the countries that they quote-unquote intervene in, essentially creating them and positioning them as the victim. Now, once they position them as the victim, they use the UN as the epitome of them being the savior to save these individuals that they have dispositioned. Now, why is this bad? This allows for more violence and the further commodification of these individuals to be modernized. So now they're savage, but their saviorism is truly savagery. They're further commodifying, and their efforts to, quote unquote, keep the peace is only a method of maintaining the good faith rhetoric for the public and shifting the public's view and the public's eye from the violence that they constantly commit. A perfect example of this would be Russia during the Chechen War, in which they committed several heinous crimes during this time period. But as a result of the utilitarianism, i.e. the saving of the majority, their crimes went untalked about. And for those reasons, you should vote AV. Thank you.
Yeah, I like taking my time, if that's okay. Good? Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Victor Kabiruka-Siaka. I'd like to thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak in the voice of the negative in this debate. Now, I'll reiterate the motion today, which is the government of this House believes that the United Nations has failed in its peacekeeping responsibilities. Now, one of the big arguments that the affirmative keeps bringing up is the fact that we're going out of this motion by expanding the meaning of peacekeeping. Now, I'll reiterate the meaning of peacekeeping that they provide, and they say that it's a way to get to sustainable peace. And yet, our first speaker came up and defined sustainable peace as having the presence of institutions that provide justice, security, and human rights as well, not only limiting it to basically reducing the wars or basically getting rid of wars, which is basically what they're limiting peace to be, just not having wars. But real sustainable peace is when you're able to have institutions that support this peace without even the need of UN intervention that can keep doing that for years to come. So that's why we're talking about having the presence of institutions that provide justice and whatnot. And we're basically stating that peacekeeping missions are doing that and have been doing that. Their main argument is the fact that the UN is ineffective, that its projects basically don't come out to life. Now, I'll give you a couple of terms that they basically used. They've been like, usually, they do not intervene. Usually, the missions are not implemented. Majority of the times, the projects are thrown off, and yet they have not given us statistics for that, and they have not contested our statistics that provide that 72 72 missions, peacekeeping missions have happened over time, and 55% of them were successful, and then you have 57 of them. Sure.
Yeah, but the UN is the agent that decides whether those agents succeeded or failed. Don't you think that they're kind of not a neutral agent to actually...
Thank you. And yet you have not even provided us a definition of success. All you have basically talked about is perfection, because what you've talked about is how the UN has to be perfect, and yet we know that nothing in this world is perfect. You've talked about how there are inefficiencies, how there are crimes being committed. Please, I'll take your point later. So you talked about how it's inefficient and how basically the UN has crimes. I'm sorry. It does have crimes, but you're not answering the question. Did it fail in its peacekeeping responsibilities? If you listen to the first speaker from our side, we talked about the peacekeeping responsibilities, what they aimed to do in that area, in that mission. So one of the examples that I could give you is, for example, in Côte d'Ivoire. In Côte d'Ivoire, what happened in Côte d'Ivoire was they came, and when they deployed 6,000 peacekeepers in 2004, they were able to take part or basically look over 2 presidential and legislative elections in 2011 and 2016. They disarmed 70,000 combatants and reintegrated them into society. Over 250,000 refugees returned in 2016. They strengthened the National Commission on Human Rights and helped decrease human rights violations. They supported social cohesion through 1,000 quick impact projects, and intercommunal conflicts were decreased by 80%. They also made sure that Ivorian administration is now present in 108 local departments departments. Now, let me even tell you another example. Let me give you another example of where it has succeeded. In Sierra Leone, where they asked the population how basically they felt, how security was after the peacekeeping missions had come and arrived and saved them from the conflict that was going on there. Now, they basically said that 90% of people who were interviewed said that their situation was much better. 90% of people who were interviewed basically said that the peacekeeping missions got them back on their feet. So I'll take your point later on. So at the end of the day, what they're talking about is basically the fact that there are limitations with the UN, that the UN peacekeepers are basically doing crimes. Yes, but they still have not answered the primary question, which is, has the UN peacekeeping missions done any good? They've not defined success, and I'm here to define it for you, which basically the first speaker had implied. Success in our terms are basically they have done what they set out to do in their particular missions, right? They basically make the UN sound, relax, I'll take your question. So they basically make the UN sound as a force that is supposed to look over the world and basically discard sovereignty and basically go and then solve everybody's problems, but that's not it. In the UN itself, they basically say that they cannot overstep their grounds and then go into a sovereign nation, which is basically still a limitation. Yes, but with those limitations, has it failed? There might have been some problems, but has it failed in itself? Can you call that a failure if you can say that 55 of their missions have basically resulted in successes? We do not deny the fact that there have been failures, but everything has failures. They've talked about two. They've talked about Rwanda. They've talked about Checo. I'm sorry, I'm bad with names. I'll apologize. But they've talked about two. And at the end of the day, let me continue and give you some more points that you can go home with. So when we're talking about what factors are required for success, as past experience shows, there are several factors that are essential for a successful, peaceful operation. It must be guided by the principles of consent, impartiality, and the non-use of force except in self-defense and defense of the mandate. Be perceived as legitimate and credible, particularly in the eyes of the local population. Promote national and local ownership of the peace process in the host country. So at the end of the day, yes?
Yeah. So with this piece, right, the UN says that to create the sustainable peace, right, it's a way to help countries torn by conflicts. You cannot create that peace without first solving the conflict. If they do not solve the conflict, then how are you achieving this peace?
I'm sorry, but I've given you statistics that you still have not contested, so that point of they're not solving the conflict just does not make sense. Because they basically recur and say that they're not solving a conflict which we basically stated has been solved. So until you give us proper statistics for that, I'm sorry, but that point does not move, that does not go anywhere. So let me go on further. The first speaker talked about today's multidimensional peacekeeping operations are called upon not only to maintain peace and security, but also to facilitate the political process, to protect civilians, assist in the disarmament, as we talked about Ivory Coast, demobilization and reintegration of former combatants, support the organizations of elections, protect and promote human rights, and assist in the restoring of the rule of law. So, at the end of the day, success cannot be guaranteed, but it has been seen in the last 60 years with all the missions that have been taken in place and the successes that we've been able to see with the 55 countries that have taken part in it. So we do agree with one thing. A perfect world has not been achieved. Some issues have come up, but because the affirmative does not even show that it is not a success, they're basically saying that there are harms being brought up by the UN, which is true. There are harms brought up by every institution in the world. But have their peacekeeping missions been a success? Have they worked? Have they fulfilled what they were supposed to fulfill? Have most of them at least done that? And that's what we've been showing you today. Thank you very much.
Again, before I begin, just once again, thank you all for being here. Thank you all for sticking around, taking your Tuesday night out to be here and listen to this debate. Now let's begin. So a major problem that we think that our opponents face here is that they're kind of creating a shifting standard for what peacekeeping is, right? When we talk about peacekeeping, we gave you a very specific UN definition of peacekeeping. That is, a way to help countries torn by conflict create conditions for sustainable peace. The problem with the opposition is that they look at that, they see the latter part of that statement, right? They see the create conditions for sustainable peace, right? And if there's no conflict, yes, the UN sure can come in and do that. The problem is that they're not engaging with that first part of that definition, the way to help countries torn by conflict. We think that in cases of conflict, you cannot create long-lasting peace without first solving that conflict, right? And now they come out here and they say, well, the UN is not perfect, right? The UN doesn't go out there to solve conflicts. Well, we think if that's the case, then that is the very issue, right? We think that that's a problem. Because we think that without that, you cannot create sustainable peace, especially at a point where that's what the world is demanding of them, right? When the UN comes in, when you think about it, when you see on the news that UN is getting involved in a conflict, do you think that what is your opinion, right? What is your view? Usually your view is that the UN is going in there to try to solve that conflict. Not the bureaucratic definition of what the UN is trying to achieve, but that's what they're there to do, right? And we think that they have fundamentally failed in that, right? We think that when they bring you this idea that like 55 missions succeeded, they kind of skate by the idea of what is the criteria for that success, right? They don't really provide that to you, right? And not to mention the fact that it's judged by UN, which is not exactly the best arbitrator for what is success and what is failure, right? So 3 questions you need to answer, right? First question is, does UN provide peace, especially in war-torn conflicts? Don't let them hijack this round and talk about like vaccination programs and stuff, right? And we think that the answer to that is no, right? We think that at a point that you're essentially in a scenario where an agent comes in and does nothing, you're not creating any peace. Think about it this way, right? If somebody is robbing you, right, and police just comes in and they just kind of stand and observe, right, which is what the UN did in Rwanda, right, as they themselves have said, right, they're there to observe, right? Is that really creating the peace? No, I think any reasonable person would agree that it's not creating any peace, right? And especially in Rwanda, where they knew about the upcoming genocide, right, where they watched and stood by what was happening, right, and where basically as soon as the genocide started to happen, what they did, they just left. And that included abandoning several refugee camps, which were actually like protected by the UN, right? And what they did, they just abandoned it and left those people to slaughter. Is that what we say is peacekeeping? I think not. And so me and Dwayne say that it is not, right? Second question is that does the UN create problems? Again, we think that the answer is yes. Right? We bring you 2 arguments to that end, right? First, we give you the idea of the rape culture that exists within the UN, right? And they say, well, Congo is like a rare exception. No, the Brahimi reports, which is a UN report, clearly said that this is a systemic problem. Congo is just one example of that, where after deploying nearly 19,000 troops, there were 15,000 rapes per year. Is that peace? That's the question that you need to answer, right? And not to mention that that peace ultimately was like unsuccessful in actually protecting civilians insofar as like both like people actually died in that, right? And then also Dwayne also brings you the idea of the good-faith rhetoric, right? The rhetoric in itself is dangerous because it allows the UN to uphold that image that they're preempting essentially local efforts, right, to say that, hey, look, we did something, we achieved success, when they really have not. They're discrediting those local agents from taking credits for that. That's inherently dangerous because that lowers the legitimacy of the local actors, right? And ultimately, that only benefits the rich nations that are ultimately in power over the UN, right? And secondly, right, and any problems that they create have to ultimately be weighed against any benefits that the opposition claims that UN provides. So ultimately, to finish off, I want to leave you with this quote that I really kind of started with from the Brahimi reports, which is the recommendation that it gave, which is that the UN should refrain from undertaking further peace enforcement actions within internal conflicts of state. So I ask you, if the UN itself admits that it is bad at, at upholding the peace, right? If they bring further conflict, and if they don't ultimately solve anything, is that a success? Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. First, I would like to approach what he said. He said that when we talked about the 55 missions that worked, that it was provided by the UN, that it shouldn't be true. But he provided certain statistics about the the quote he just said at last, and what he said that the UN is not working, and he got those statistics from the UN. So at the end of the day, he's contradicting himself if he's saying that our statistics aren't true and theirs are true, but they're coming from the same source. Secondly, I would like to say that we provided the different things that the UN has done, how it went to DRC, how it went to Central African country, how it contributed to women and peace and security, how it gave vaccination to children. And that is supposed to back up our saying that 55 missions actually worked. But they haven't shown any statistics that show how those 55 missions didn't work. Now, they have said that the UN is not solving any roots of the conflict, that they're not providing sustainable peace according to the UN's explanation of peacekeeping. But that's not true. We said, yes, UN is bringing sustainable peace. How are they doing it? We say that they solve conflict they solve a different conflict through the better use of natural resources. That Rwanda's UN troops have gone through building classrooms, building hospitals, training locals, the better use of energy, going through and supervising elections. All of these are helping to solve roots that lead to violence in those different countries. Now, they're repeating the fact that UN has contributed to violence and to the different problems in different countries. We are not against it, but we are showing you facts that overrule those problems. They are not working. We are saying that they have brought more solutions than the problems that they have caused. We are not against them having caused problems. Like Victor said before, the UN is not perfect, but that's not what we're talking about right here. What we're talking about is that it hasn't failed because most of the mission it was supposed to do, they were successfully done. I'll repeat what they have done. Food has been provided to 19 million people in 75 countries. They have assisted to more than 34 million refugees. They have minimized climate change by working with 140 nations. They have assisted 50 countries per year in their elections. They have provided 58% of children in the world. That's about 4 billion every single year. And they helped about 30 million women per year with maternal health efforts. Now, does the UN create problems? That's his question. We are not against it. Like I said before, UN, yes, creates problems. But does it remove the fact that it solves more problems than those it caused? No, it solves more problems. And I will repeat again, it saves 4 billion children a year. They're talking about 50,000 people. We are talking about 4 billion children a year. I'm giving the 50,000 people because that's the only people they're talking about. So at the end of the day, the UN hasn't failed because we are showing how it has done more. And they have shown only one number, 50,000 people. Also, I would like to remind you that the UN doesn't all the time have power to act in every mission they are given. Like I said before, the UN, some of their mission is observational missions. Now, why these missions are there is because some countries do not allow the UN to actually do anything in the country. That's what happened in Rwanda. What happened in Rwanda is that the government did not allow UN to do anything, and so UN UN troops were taken out of the country. Would they have done better to save people in the country? Maybe. But does it mean that they have not done their mission of observing? No. Yes, they did. So at the end of the day, in this debate, the negative, our side, should win. Because we are showing, in terms of numbers, how they have done more than their harm. And secondly, we are simply showing that their affirmative have shown nothing in comparison to the statistics, to the facts that we have shown. And that just simply shows how the UN was better than all the problems it has caused. Thank you.